So Ferguson is, as you may have heard in the news, is a really small suburb of St. Louis. It's about 15 minutes from downtown St. Louis. So as I think in Philly terms, for me it's a 10-minute subway ride to downtown Philly from West Philly where I live. Then that is even short. I mean, it really was short. And so I was spent a lot of my time working with folks in St. Louis, which is this bunch of little tiny municipalities, and I have a host of experiences there and a lot of stories from folks there that I'm looking forward to sharing with you all this evening. And what I know will happen is we'll be done before 9:30 Eastern Time. Thought because of tech in the beginning we might need a little bit more than 9 o'clock to get through this. And so I have some folks who are here on video, and I'm wondering if maybe one of the folks on video, you have a question that might be a helpful place to get started. So, like, what's something you've been wondering about what's happening in Ferguson that you want to know about?
Well, Matthew, this is Eileen, and one of the things that really struck me when you came home from Ferguson in September was how different your stories were from the stories that we were hearing in the media. About the looting, for example, but other things as well, that the picture you got was really different. And right now, you know, we're mostly getting our pictures from the media or from Facebook or whatever, and so I'd be curious, like, what do you think are the biggest misconceptions that people in other parts of the country have about what's going on?
Yeah. So one that's fresh on, thank you, Eileen. I really appreciate that. I'm very much from this call and response culture, and so when I have no response, it's really hard. And if you have if anyone else has a question, you can tweet Ferguson Q&A as the hashtag, email EQATEAM, that's equateteam@gmail.com, or post a message on the Facebook wall. And so different folks are watching out for those for your questions. And for me, one of the huge misconceptions at this point has been really the whole grand jury indictment situation that actually happened in Ferguson explicitly. So there was a period of time where people were really paying attention to this grand jury and what's going on. And in St. Louis, folks started to see that the governor had created a state of emergency. This is back in August. And people started to pressure the governor to say, Governor, appoint a special prosecutor because Bob McCullough, the prosecutor, is biased. And part of the reason he's biased is because his father was killed by a police officer, and most of his cases that he's chosen to prosecute are on behalf of police officers. And so he has a history of really advocating on behalf of the police and not in a neutral fashion at all. And so when I was in St. Louis, about a couple days in, Bob McCullough, or the governor, ended the state of emergency. And part of that was because people started pressuring the governor to say, get a special prosecutor, because with emergency conditions, a state of emergency, he had the power to do that. But what I didn't know going in was that Bob McCullough is one of the most powerful people politically in the state of Missouri. For instance, the governor, Jay Nixon, looked to Bob McCullough for support to even get elected in the first place. And so for Bob McCullough to recuse himself is sort of to ask the governor to do this. As soon as you ask the governor, he backs away. To think about, even now, the conversations about, oh, there's another judge that could make that decision to get rid of Bob McCullough. Although he's the prosecutor in St. Louis County, he has a ton of political power across the state. He is one of the key political players. And he has more power not being the governor than he ever would being the governor. And so he's not willing to give up that power. And for instance, the night that the lack of indictment showed up for Darren Wilson, where Mike Brown's murderer wasn't indicted, the news reporters, I was watching two things at once. I was watching the folks in St. Louis, a friend's live stream, and I was watching the local news also. And the local news in St. Louis was talking about, oh, well, this is going to be just like every other Bob McCullough press conference that happens. He will come in, it will be under a half an hour, he will talk for most of the time. He may take a few questions, nothing that is outside of what he already has planned to talk about will be answered, and then he will leave, and we will all go home. And that they knew the routine of Bob McCullough so clearly showed me that he has a very particular public relationship, that he answers that people, he often goes very unquestioned in that state. And so the entire indictment, the process of a grand jury looking at the case, most local people in St. Louis said, well, he's not going to get indicted. We already know this. I mean, the statement on the ground was that he, the governor, that every politician in the state would basically let the city of St. Louis burn to the ground before they ever indicted Darren Wilson. And they never expected that at all. And so that's a bit of the misinformation that was going on about it, that grand jury ever might come out with something different. So that's one story. Another question I'd be glad to answer. And the folks who are on video chat right now are getting the questions that you email, tweet, and Facebook comment in. So they're looking to those to also answer. I see you talking, Eileen, and you're muted.
Matthew, I just got a message. Hi, team. Nothing is coming through on the conference call except occasional pings.
Oh, I am sorry. I turned off the microphone. Can you hear me now on the conference call line? If you can, send an email back. I am so sorry about that. It was muted. I hear that people were getting on and off. Thank you for bearing with the tech issues. We're trying to work this out. Yeah. And thanks for saying it. Kind of think if there's another story that feels like an entry point in that also feels helpful. Yeah, I'm just trying to think about what's another misconception with the news. Oh, there was that burned car that happened the night of the lack of indictment, and because there's no good language for a lack of indictment, right, which is when there's not even a trial. That's the thing that I have to keep remembering, or keep reminding other people of, is like there was never a trial for Darren Wilson. There was actually just a decision not to even have a trial in the case of Darren Wilson, and similarly in the case of Eric Garner. There was no actual public trial at all. And so each of the people who were the grand juries were not getting, that's not their role. Their role is to see if this is a case that should go forward or not. So that night of watching the whole grand jury decision happen in St. Louis, where I was in Philadelphia at this point, and part of it is I've been very explicit with folks in St. Louis. When I left after about a month, and for about a week before I left, I kept saying, like, if there's something that you need, ask me for it. And they were pretty clear. They had most of the skills that they needed to go forward in organizing. I see a question. And so...
Excuse me, one second, Matthew. I hear that they can hear. I got an email that they can hear you now, but no video yet.
No video yet. On the phone, there will never be video.
Right.
If you have video on your web page, you should be able to refresh it and it should show up. If it still doesn't, I'm going to put another link out there that might help it. Whew. There's only so much. Unfortunately, Google has not caught up with the needs of social movements in a really complicated way. So I will do my best to get you... Oh, great. It should be working now. I see if you go to the eqat.org/Ferguson page, there is video there now. And the Facebook page, I would say refresh your page and try again. Hopefully it'll work. If not, please keep letting Eileen know. It's super helpful to have that level of communication. But I see, I just was playing it and I saw it playing. The video might be delayed, so if you're on the phone, you're getting it faster than most people who are seeing the video are. So if you're looking at your computer also, you might get a little disoriented. Uh, but the thing I want to share about that night is that it was very choreographed, the response that happened in St. Louis. From the timing of the announcement by Bob McCullough, which was at 9 p.m., when we had heard that the grand jury knew earlier in the morning, they just kept delaying and delaying and delaying when they would announce it. I mean, you announce something at 9 p.m., and give people zero space to respond. You just expect them to deal with your news that you're not going to look into the murder of an 18-year-old boy. It's just asking for people to be upset and unhappy. And in St. Louis, there was all this news about looting happening in St. Louis. And one of the things in Ferguson is that there are two main streets. They're called West Florissant and South Florissant. They're parallel to each other. They're about a 10-minute drive away from each other. And West Florissant is right near where Mike Brown got murdered. He got murdered about a block away from there, right off of West Florissant. And that's primarily a place where black folks live, and it's there's a lot of poor black folks who live on West Florissant or near West Florissant. And South Florissant is the white side of town, mostly. Not completely, but mostly white. And it is significantly, I mean, the sidewalks are paved, and there's cobblestone in places where there are just potholes on West Florissant. And that night, on South Florissant, the police were blocking almost all of the businesses. They were standing in front of the businesses, making sure no one could enter those businesses, that nothing would happen to any of those businesses. Meanwhile, on West Florissant, just 10 minute, about a 5-minute drive, 15-minute walk, honestly, you have people who are upset and going through the streets, and the police are sitting at stoplights just watching anything happen. So if the police are there to really protect the neighborhood and protect the businesses, they weren't. They could have. I mean, they had capacity. The county had sent police from all over to show up, and they weren't doing anything. Instead, they were letting the black side of town really get people get angry on the black side of town and not respond in any way that was helpful. Instead, it was more hurtful. And so the news cameras were there showing the story of West Florissant, ignoring the difference of South Florissant, where the police department was. And so that's just one of the ways in which this story has really been built up, of like the protesters are out of control. I mean, the police force really manipulates the story there. And a lot of what happens is really heavily incited by police. I saw that over and over again while I was there, just seeing the police arrest random people. Like there was this one time in late August where people were trying to shut down the highway. I-70, one of the major highways. And as people were trying to go onto the exit ramps to get off, the police had arrested a lot of people who sort of got down to the highway, and there were more people trying. But most people were just gathering and watching at this point. And there was this one woman who had a sign, and the police started doing this thing where there would be groups of 5 of them. And the 5 of them would just start strutting around and sort of saying, "Get out of the way! Get out of the way!" And so this woman wasn't backing away fast enough for them. And so she fell. And as she's trying to get up, and she's holding this sign also, so she falls down and she tries to climb and get up. And as she gets up, they're yanking the sign out of her hand, and so she's using the sign to get up. And so since she can't even do that, like they try and pull it out of her hands. Eventually they pull it out of her hands and then arrest her as she was trying to back away with her sign. I mean, 5 minutes later, the police were angry because someone who they wanted to arrest had gotten away. One of the people, someone similar to this woman who had just been a protester, he got away, and so they were so angry. And so suddenly another person who they want to arrest runs away through the crowd, and we're right by a gas station. And there is this young black man in a backpack. He has this light blue backpack. I remember him so well. And he had just been walking up being like, "I don't know what's going on. There's actually a college right there." He looked like a student. And the police lose track of the person who they're trying to arrest, so they just turn and arrest this other black dude. He was doing nothing. I watched him that whole time. He just was showing up. He was like literally like standing right there, and they just arrested him because they were angry that they weren't getting the person who they originally wanted to arrest. And so the way in which the police are behaving out there is really, I mean, we use the language police state or demilitarize the police, and they're acting oftentimes like an occupying army in those neighborhoods, where they are out there trying to just show they have control, not for public safety, but for control's sake, in this way that it just weighs down on your shoulders every time you're moving there. Like, I would do these drives. I mean, a joke that a friend, Tori, said while I was there, my first day, he said, everything's about 15 minutes away from everything else, which is basically true. You can get just about anywhere in St. Louis in about 15 minutes. And in just about every 15-minute drive that I did, I saw about 4 police officers pulling over someone. Almost, I never saw them pull over a black person in those circumstances. A white person, sorry. Thank you. I never saw them pull over a white person in those circumstances. They pulled over lots of black people. They were all black. They were all black. Every single one was black. They oftentimes had people outside of the car for traffic violations. And often people have bench warrants for traffic violations. Because in St. Louis, in the city and in the county, there is this thing where if you get a traffic violation, then there are extra fees, like administrative fees, that get added on top of it. And so say your tail light is out, or your registration just expired, and you get a ticket in Ferguson. Well, then you drive 2 minutes down the road to Jennings, and then you get pulled over again, because it's a completely different police jurisdiction, and so then you get another ticket. And so by the time you get home, maybe you have 2 tickets. Maybe the next day, if you need to drive to work, you get 3. You have 3 tickets. Say the ticket itself was each $100. You add on about another $100, $200, $100 in fees. So now you owe $600. Suddenly you're owing $600, and you can't afford $600, and so you may go to court for one of the times, or you may try and go. And people go to court to pay these things at the crack of dawn because they need to try and get there before they shut the doors. And so if you're lucky enough to pay off your ticket, you might not be able to pay off your next one. And so eventually you get a warrant out for your arrest. And so you get a warrant out for your arrest, which affects everything you're able to do, where you're able to move, thinking about driving. Like most people I met most people I know in St. Louis have multiple warrants out on their head. Multiple warrants. 21-year-olds, 18-year-olds, 33-year-olds, all with warrants. 50-year-olds with multiple warrants. Retired folks with multiple warrants out for their arrest. And so it's actually horrible and staggering, and I say it so quickly now because I'm a little further away, but it's absolute chaos. It affects every public service that you are able to access, and so people are unable to do basic functions, and then they get arrested. They get caught with a bench warrant at some point, and then they go to jail. And maybe once you've been in one jail, then they send you to the next jail for your other bench warrant. And then hopefully that third place doesn't want to take you because they're slow, but they've made you wait extra long in the jail cell. Oftentimes they'll call and say, hey, we're going to come pick up this person, and then they have 24 hours to pick you up. At the 23rd hour, you get an announcement that they're not coming, and so then you might get let out. And you get let out, but in St. Louis, there's no time served. And so in Ferguson, and in St. Louis County and in St. Louis City, you leave and you owe what you owed when you went in. And you've probably lost a job because you've been in jail. You haven't made any more money. Your family is trying to scramble to get things together. And so how are you going to pay this fine anymore? Instead, you're likely to just get another warrant out for your arrest again and get stuck going back to jail again. And so people are stuck in these cycles of not being able to move around the city to be able to drive to a job. Public transit is miserable, so taking the bus is both dangerous and I mean, inefficient is a gentle word for it. Thank you, Mo. I have one of my friends who's here is also here in person, and is being helpful. It is completely inefficient. It is like, I mean, do you really want to take multiple hours to get along? Like, eventually, I was working with Missourians Organized for Reform and Empowerment, which is one of the key groups doing a lot of work on the ground. They've been running the jail support line since the very beginning. And they've worked very closely with the Organization for Black Struggle. And Missourians Organized for Reform and Empowerment had hired some folks onto staff. And when I was there, I was driving people from place to place, driving people to work because they couldn't get to work on a regular basis. And so while we were in there, we tried to start transitioning to me not driving them as frequently. And figuring out the bus system was just mass chaos. I mean, people they gave up very quickly. They said, well, now I just need to find someone else to give me a ride, because taking the bus, a 10-minute drive, actually is not going to make any sense for me to try and get to work, because it's going to take me an hour to get the same distance as a 10-minute drive, because it might be multiple buses, and then a good walk from there.
Matthew, I don't know if Arna or Lena have questions, but I am getting some through email, and there's one that seems to fit what you're talking about now. Mm-hmm. Which is, there's a couple people wondering kind of what exactly are people in Ferguson working for now, since there's so many layers to this problem, from bench warrants to, racist cops to the indictment process. So the most specific wording of the question is, what do folks in Ferguson see as immediate and longer-term campaign goals? Who are the targets, and what is the ask?
Such a good question, and such a hard question. Partially because the national spotlight is something really hard to get out from under, and it takes a lot of your energy when you're there. I remember sitting in many very long meetings, and although I right now work regularly with Quakers, long meetings are something I hate, and I appreciate I work with a group that doesn't spend so much time in meetings. I remember one day I was in 5 meetings. No meeting was shorter than, I think there was one meeting that was an hour and a half. Most were more than 2 hours. And so it's really hard to actually get strategy thinking. And at the same time when I was there, I was able to work hard to find enough space so that organizers on the ground, and I have pictures of a lot of folks who I worked with up behind me, because it's actually a really grounding thing for me. And so we did a retreat together, which was basically, let's get everybody else out of the room so the young folks, which means under 35, the young folks could be in the same room together. And they did all this skill development, relationship building, like training folks on one-on-ones, how to talk to media. Like, if you got the other people out of the room, they could do that, and they could think about strategy. And still now they're actually trying to figure out what are long-term goals and what are short-term goals. Because with this constant national attention and the energy that was so focused on Darren Wilson and the potential indictment, that people actually had to spend a lot of time saying, how do we organize folks in these neighborhoods all over the city so that the response is powerful yet minimizes the number of folks, that minimizes the city burning. Like in August, I just remember the young folks sharing stories of being on the front lines, and on the front lines in August was keeping hundreds and sometimes thousands of people nonviolent. And that was a lot of their work, was keeping people nonviolent. And so they had to spend time then trying to really work with folks to be like, how are we going to have nonviolent responses when we know what's going to happen, when we know there's not going to be an indictment? And so they were training and talking with people over and over again, and that was a lot of the organizing. A lot of what we didn't see in the news was the nonviolent responses that were happening in most places. Like, yes, there were people who were angry, but there was a ton of nonviolence. There were a ton of people on the street doing de-escalation work. The work that you might think police might do, protesters were doing that de-escalation work. And so in terms of long-term goals, it's there. I mean, I love some of the ideas. I mean, people are know that the behind the bench warrants are thinking about felonies and felonies that keep people from being able to get jobs and being able to function through life more so than even bench warrants do. There actually was some work on a bench warrant campaign that started before Mike Brown got killed. And that was started sort of by a couple different groups coming together. One was local folks looking at what's an issue that they could do in relation to mass incarceration. And so I think it was like the week before it was actually the week before Mike Brown got murdered, they had their first meeting about what to do about bench warrants. And at the same time, there were a group of lawyers called the Arch City Defenders who are great. And what they got together to do before Mike Brown got murdered was to really think about advocating for homeless people throughout the city. And they quickly found out that bench warrants were getting in the way of people being able to actually access services. So homeless folks with bench warrants weren't able to access services. And so most of the time, the Arch City Defenders, the lawyers, were spending their time trying to get rid of bench warrants so that they could help make sure their clients were able to get the services that were there. And so so that's one campaign that's been in motion and continues to be in motion. They did this great white paper that has a ton of information actually about what's been happening in St. Louis. Like they did a study where they looked at the municipalities of St. Louis County and looked at the rates of how people were arrested or were pulled over. And so they saw that Black people were pulled over at a 2-for-1 ratio, so twice as often as white people were pulled over. And at the same time, when pulled over, white people were twice as likely to have something illegal in their car than a Black person was. And that's just the numbers of St. Louis County, that Black folks are targeted more, even though white folks are guilty more often of doing the crime. And so that bench warrant campaign work is also about doing work to undo some of the racist system that is at play in St. Louis. So that's one campaign that is really clear. There are a lot of other ideas about what people can do, and a lot of other thoughts people are thinking about. How can we make sure that schools are functioning or build out-of-school programs? Like Hands Up United has already started some reading programs that are happening outside. But in terms of protests and some goals, a lot of it right now has been supporting folks who are pissed off to find a way to express their anger and start getting plugged into thinking about organizing. And so locally, they continue to have conversations about what long-term can look like.
Hey, Matthew.
Hey, Arda.
This is also probably a hard question, but you've talked about St. Louis County having 91 municipalities, and each one of those municipalities having its own police force, and and how that incentivizes a lot of over-policing because of the revenue. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about just a little bit more about that for folks who haven't heard that already. And also, like, if there's been any ideas about, like, maybe collapsing some of the departments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, yeah, St. Louis County does have 91 municipalities, and St. Louis County is not that big. I mean, I would drive every day. I would drive through probably at least 4 to 10, 15 municipalities. Like, you could easily do it in a short period of time. And so, and that most of them have their own police department. Not everyone, actually, I've learned since. So one of the things that has happened is actually some of the police departments have been shown to be so corrupt that the county has taken over their police department, or another municipality has taken over their police department. It doesn't mean the revenue doesn't go back to that county still, but it just means that they kept being so corrupt and kept getting caught that they lost their ability to have that service. And so there isn't a lot of conversation about collapsing those. I mean, people are talking about it explicitly, being like, why do we have so many municipalities. This is completely unnecessary to have all of these tiny little towns where they have their own little city council or mayor or municipal services. I mean, when Ferguson is 21,000 people, and then next to it there's another 21,000. Delmar, which is close by, is another, not Delmar, I forget the name of that place, which is just south, which is also a dot of a town, which I think has 30,000 people. And so they're very tiny municipalities that are urban and dense. And what's helpful to think about when you think about St. Louis is that St. Louis made a law early on in the 1900s where they said the city, where they defined the city boundaries separate from the county. And so the city is this contained place where it's actually hard to see when you leave the city and enter the county, because most major cities actually have expanded to take over those smaller suburbs. Like I live in Philadelphia, and Philadelphia County is now Philadelphia City, where now St. Louis County is actually separate from St. Louis City because of that law that they created. Part of it was because they didn't want poor folks being able to affect elections in the city. But over time, what's happened is that there was white flight out of the city into the suburbs, and now black folks have been leaving, I mean, for quite some time, like decades now, black folks have been leaving and going to the suburbs, and white folks have been moving even further out of St. Louis County. And so these counties that were originally poor became middle class and now are sort of working poor. And more multiracial than they were, and more integrated. I mean, a lot of the stuff of the civil rights movement really affected that area. Has some positive, and it makes it harder. So integration, in some ways, is an amazing system, but it also got some of the infrastructure that black communities have set up. Oftentimes, so schools where you know your teacher and you know your neighborhood, suddenly that's not the sense anymore. And so there's some animosity that is built up over years because of that as well. So that white neighbors are like, why am I have to be stuck next to you, black person? And black people being like, why are you being such snobs? And other things like that. And so it's really, I mean, the mayor of Ferguson said there's no racial divide in Ferguson, and yet there is a clear line through the middle of the city where you can tell, like, the houses change when you go over to the white side, where it's mostly white folks, versus the black side, which is mostly poor black folks. The white side also has middle-class black folks as well. But that's a little bit about the geography and how that affects what some of what's happening. There are other major cities with a similar problem, like Pittsburgh, for instance. There are a ton of little municipalities, and people get stuck getting arrested all over the place. And that is space where people could think about a campaign. Like why are there a million little municipalities? This doesn't seem helpful or a good use of our resources. Because then people get policed so that the municipalities make money. That's what Ferguson got caught with. They were making, what, 30% of their budget off of their police force arresting people and giving tickets to people. It was ridiculous. It was absolutely ridiculous. So yeah. Another question.
Matthew, I have a question. This is Lena.
Yeah.
Coming back to Philadelphia and sort of being with other folks who are reacting to what they're seeing on the news, what are reactions that you have found frustrating, and what are reactions that you've found helpful from folks who generally mean well and generally like aren't like arguing that the court made the right decision or whatever, or the grand jury made the right decision or whatever, but folks who are concerned with the outcome? What reactions from those folks have you found most helpful, and what have you found more frustrating?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'd say one thing that sticks with me is just I paid very little. I don't have cable. I paid very little attention to the cable news, and I was so grateful for that when I got to St. Louis, because I could actually be with people's real stories about what was going on. Like, one of the stories that was put out in huge ways was that Mike Brown stole those cigarellos from the store down the block. That, although, I mean, there's now more footage that even puts into question whether or not he even stole anything, the store never called the cops. The store never called the police. Instead, that was the police looking for some reason to justify it and shift the media narrative into making Mike Brown look like a criminal. And the media, and afterwards, some news outlets said, "Oh, wait, it didn't actually happen." But it's way, I mean, most people who work in media know to rescind a story is nearly impossible. No one's ever going to actually slow down to do that. But that, for me, one thing that has been really difficult to hear is just how much people have seen Mike Brown as a criminal. And even as we look at Eric Garner, how people are like, oh, he was selling Lucy's on the street, and the cops had arrested him before, or had bothered him before about that. Like, dude was trying to make some money just selling some cigarettes. People do that all the time. You do not die. You do not deserve to die for that. And so there's a big way in which I feel like the narrative of black-on-black crime is another hideous example of this. Yeah. We talk of black-on-black-white crime, yet there is never such a thing as white-on-white crime. Instead, black people are constantly criminalized. And for me, it's been really hard to see see that show up every day among people who might not otherwise, who I haven't heard say that before. And so they just fall they fall into that trap so quickly. And it's not that they are, and I say they fall into that trap because it's set up for them to fall into, and that just going through your normal experience, it just seeps in regularly. And even when I was in St. Louis, like, I came back, and my relationship with the police is way different than when it was, both because I swear a lot more when I see them, and because I actually have a lot more difficulty negotiating with the police than I've had before. I've always felt I'm really good with negotiating with the cops when I'm in a protest setting, to be like, I'm going to get my way, and I'm going to keep my people safe. And I noticed when I went to an action, soon as I went back, I asked the cops for permission to, like, walk somewhere, and I was like, I've never, ever asked the cops if I can walk somewhere. But that idea that I could be seen as guilty became so much more much in my awareness. And because when I was in St. Louis, every time I was in the car with folks, they would say, slow down, you don't want to go to jail. Slow down, you don't want to go to jail. Not slow down, you don't want to get a ticket. It's slow down, you don't want to go to jail. Because that is such the reality there. And that seeped into my ability to process the world. And still is present with me. It's very hard. I mean, I was helping out with Quaker Action Team's big day of action this past weekend. And I know I did not want to have anything to do with the cops, because I just knew I'm not as sharp as I usually am in that. And your second half of your question, Lena, was like, what have been the reactions that have been helpful? I'd say that some of the reactions that have been helpful have been with folks who say, okay, so I don't know the real story, tell me more about it. Tell me what's actually going on. Tell me who are these people, because, I mean, the CNN, I have never loved CNN, but I now can see straight through the lies of their recordings. Like, there's this one video where Don Lemon is getting, ooh, thank goodness, we almost went offline, where Don Lemon is getting, like, pushed back through the crowd by police officers in these costumes. Police officers in their outfits. And he's being pushed back. And this was broadcast as like, oh, media getting harassed. Meanwhile, there's this moment that comes where he's getting pushed and pushed and pushed. And then suddenly the cop goes this way, and Don Lemon just starts walking forward. And if you were in St. Louis, you know that would have never have happened. He would have been arrested, he would have been on the ground, he would have been hurt. And you see that they just created this whole story alongside the police and the National Guard that showed certain pieces and didn't show other pieces. And so to see how closely in bed that national media is with the police and with the power structures was really sickening. And so for me, it has been so helpful when folks have said, I don't know what's actually going on. I mean, the other reaction that has been helpful for me has been folks who say, what can I do? Or they just start doing stuff. Like that, I'd say that has been the other thing that has been so helpful. Like the night the grand jury indictment did not come out, when there was no indictment, the folks who just took to the streets. I mean, I needed that. Like, I needed that because I felt myself getting stuck and still and frustrated and angry as I watched through my friend's eyes what was happening with Mike Brown's mom right in front of him. And like to feel so angry and stuck being here in Philly and not being in St. Louis at that time. And to be able to go out and be like, folks have already organized an action, and all I just need to do is show up and support, and I can be loud as hell, and I totally can do that. And so that was some of what's been really helpful, is the folks who are showing up in the streets.
Well, Matthew, that ties into the other theme of questions that I've seen that are around the how can I help? And I'll just bundle them together because there's the kind of general how can I help? There's who should we give money to is a question that came in if we want to help people on the ground in Ferguson. And then also in this bundle is, do you have any words for white allies who feel hesitant to take action because they want to be sure to be honoring people of color leadership and space?
Mm-hmm. So 3 questions. I heard 3.
Yeah, they're all in the theme of what can I do, so I threw them together.
Okay. So the place I start is show up. I mean, like, there have been so many black folks who I've seen online being like, just show up, show up. Like, for me, that night, I just knew I had to show up. Like, it wasn't just about my own reaction. I was like, I need to get out there and do something in this moment, both because I'm pissed off and because something needs to change in this situation. So I want to go out there and support whoever is making that change happen in this moment. I may not have been doing this stuff in Philly explicitly, but I want to make sure it happens. And I have a skill set, and I want to bring all of my skills and all of my passion and my voice there. And so for me, a big piece has been people just showing up and not getting stuck in conversations about, well, how do I show up? What can I do? Where can I go? Like, yes, those are real reactions, and the people who I see that happening among most are white folks. I have no desire to, I mean, I personally, and I as a black person, personally have no desire to sit through those conversations. Just go out. There's a protest every day or every 2 days. Maybe 3 days will go by and then there's a protest. I mean, it takes some sleuth work, but if you ask folks, there's often someone who knows how to find one. That's one big thing. I mean, that's one big clear thing for me, is just to take the step to show up. And if you are involved and you're not, or if you are involved in other groups or other things like that, bring your skills, bring your full self out there, because that's what people need. People's voices get hoarse if they have to lead a rally for 3 hours or a march for 3 hours. They need support in doing that. I mean, I was so grateful once when I was helping out with one of the marches that was 3 hours long, and I was trying to help in the front as they were trying to keep people together, yet I was having to run a block back because the crowd was so big, because I didn't know anybody else to be able to ask for help to find out what was happening in the back and if we were leaving folks behind. And so, like, once I finally had someone who was there, who was actually a white woman, show up and be like, hey, I'll text you when we need to slow down, and she did. That made it so much easier for me. So that's some of the work that I think is helpful. And I don't think white folks need to show up and then take center stage. When you get there, when you get to an action, you'll see there are folks who are already showing up and doing something. But if they look like they have 5 things in their hand, like when you see someone running around with a clipboard and a megaphone in one hand, and then they have like a pen and a cell phone in their other hand, like, see what you can take. See if you can. I mean, literally, one time at an action, I literally saw someone holding this big banner, and she was also holding the microphone. I said, hey, can I hold that banner for you? Just like a simple ask like that is really helpful to show up on that level. I think in terms of level of risk and what you're willing to take alongside folks, figure out what that is. If it's laying down in the streets, if it's getting arrested, if whatever it is, figure that out. If you have legal support near where you are, figure that out beforehand. Like there's oftentimes, one of the great things Occupy did across the country was get legal hotlines set up in cities and towns all over the place. So if you're in a major city, there's probably some sort of legal collective that is looking to support activists. And so you get it out, you write their number on your arm, and then if you choose to risk arrest, you have a number to call. And there's some level of support that's already there. So that's some. I think that answers one or two of the questions. And I can get to the funding question a little bit later. Arna, though, I think you have a question. But I will come back to the funding one.
Yeah, I have a question that's asking if, taking to the streets and direct action like that isn't the way that you see yourself getting involved. What are other ways that people can show up?
Nice. That's so hard. And I used to not be a taking to the streets person. That's the thing that's really funny. I am so, that is, I mean, my job is with the direct action group now. And some of it, I think, is actually just stepping outside the comfort zone to try that at least once. I think that is actually really helpful in sorting through what might be something else you may want to do. And then there are also other creative ways that folks are showing up. Like I just got an invitation from a group of dancers across the country who are saying, like, we want to do something in terms of dance. For this weekend, they're organizing in major cities these dance things to raise awareness about what's happening. I think about the symphony action that happened in St. Louis that was organized largely by actually a middle-class group of folks where they went to the symphony and they sang what was called a Requiem for Mike Brown, which is now available on YouTube. And so you can watch that Requiem where in between the first and the second half of the show, right before the second began, they started singing Which Side Are You On? And they sang it as a requiem for Mike Brown's life. And they chose to drop some banners, but some people just sang. And that if you can sing, going out and singing is one thing to do. If you're a teacher and you work so many hours that you can get out you can't get out because teachers tend to work so many hours. Thinking about some of it is talking with your students. Some of it is sitting with them and listening to what's going on. Some of it is helping your friends figure out how might they be able to take some sort of action. Some of it is figuring out what's the issue that's going on in your town. Like in Philly, what is it? I live at 50, they're 4 blocks away from my house. They're moving the police headquarters, for instance. That is something I can in some way develop something alongside. I'm working on an art project on the side that has to do with spirituals. That was the initial project. And yet we're really shifting it because we're like, there is a moment that we're in the midst of, and we're going to be dealing with audiences who aren't necessarily on the streets. So how can we help them start to think about what's an action step that they can take? But really, when you're feeling yourself stuck, I think one of the best things to do is to at least start talking to someone else. And if you're a white ally, I don't think that means you start talking to your black friend. I think it might mean you start talking to your white allies, your white friends about it. Because that is a place where that conversation can really happen, and it doesn't make the black folks in your life or the folks of color in your life responsible for figuring out what you can do. But that you can start to sort through what can I do, and it gives the folks of color space to deal with the mourning and the anger and the sadness and the seeing themselves criminalized every day on the news and seeing a public debate about whether murdering an 18-year-old or a 12-year-old is valid. Like to have to deal with that every day is emotionally draining and a horrible thing to have to do. And so as black folks are trying to do that across the country, and as folks of color are grappling with how are they engaging with this, I think it's the place of white folks to say, okay, what is my skill set? What is the world that I work in, and where can I affect change? Like I'm just to offer one other anecdote about it. I'm thinking about Princeton, where I used to work, and there were students there, and they organized a die-in at Princeton, and some staff and faculty also showed up to that die-in, and that it wasn't taking to the streets, but at Princeton, in a culture that is so elite, where that everything is up for a debate, and where the racism and the sexism is built into the bricks there. For people just to say that they were going was a big step for them. And so to look to your context to be like, what's a big step for me to be more bold? Yeah. Whew. There are a lot of lies out there in the media. I'm just thinking again, like the looting in the summer. Yeah. What a lie. So much of that was. I mean, there were protesters out there stopping people from going into stores, and that a lot of those folks were actually the snitches. They were the folks that the police informants in neighborhoods, the police told them, go out this day. And so suddenly the police are sitting back, arms folded, watching these folks go out and rob stores. And these were folks who were like, oh my God, I can get milk? I haven't been able to feed my family. And so folks aren't just going out to just get stuff. They're going out to get the things that they need. And the police have set them up to do that. Meanwhile, protesters are blocking them. And then eventually, what happened is during the second day of what we media called looting, there was a moment where suddenly all of the looters, or a lot of them, most of them, left the stores and they headed off this direction. And the police had been like right here, basically watching the whole thing, the news, reporting everything. And there are protesters who have been here being like, don't loot, don't, and like just trying to keep people out. It's a lie, it's a trick, don't do it. And what happens is the police who are here just turn, and they don't go after the folks who were looting. They go after the protesters. The tanks roll out after those protesters, and they just go right after them. And that the media narrative, because the media was right there, they saw the two pieces, but what they showed was black folks are robbing stuff and the police are just having to respond. But it's not the same people. And what it does is actually build this idea that all of the black folks are criminals. Meanwhile, the black folks were out there when the National Guard was shooting out street lights in neighborhoods, shooting out street lights so that they were dark. And the black folks, 14-year-old kids, were running out into the street. They were running out to get people from cars who were driving home from work, who were at home and didn't know what was happening. When tear gas was being shot into residential neighborhoods, people were going out and making sure that folks were able to get out and get safe or get the care that they need when they saw them being attacked by the policing force. I mean, what truly felt like an invading army, so similar to what it looks like in Palestine so much of the time. Did you have a question? Gotcha.
Well, there is one question. You just can't see me, but someone wants to know if there's any meaningful talk about restorative justice or victim-offender mediation instead of relying on police.
Yeah, there's a lot of thought about, actually. That's Mo, who's also on Facebook, so if you send a message there. There is some talk about it. I think about, I suddenly forgot his name. There's so many people. There's this young dude who you can totally find online, and he's awesome. And he lives in, wow. Suddenly I can't remember the names of places where I spent so much of my time. He lives basically less than a minute. His house basically looks out to where Mike Brown was killed. He lives in Canfield Apartments. And in Canfield, he and other folks actually started to organize so that they could keep the police out of their neighborhood. And so they were doing workshops with folks who do cop watch in the Bronx, for instance, and they were learning how can they build up a force so that the police aren't what folks are looking to in their neighborhood. So now that when the police drive through Canfield, they make sure they're outside and visible and the police roll on. They've had conversations with the police saying, no, this is not your territory. You actually have no jurisdiction here. Get out. And they make sure they have folks out there every day keeping an eye on actually what's going on, both in terms of neighborhood safety and in terms of safety from the police. At the same time, there are folks also, I think there's a group of healing folks in St. Louis who are trying to really be a resource. And so they have been going into people's apartments, throughout Canfield's apartments, where Mike Brown was murdered, and actually talking with folks. And some of those folks are also in New York. I mean, there are clear relationships across the country. And that the people are taking the time to actually try and get some of that care that they need. In terms of shifting the relationship with the police, it's a very fraught relationship, and in short term, there isn't a lot that might shift. Long term, there's a lot of potential that things, potentially could shift. But even as we've now heard more and more in the news over the past 2 weeks, like in St. Louis, there are 2 police officers associations. There's one which is headed by this guy who is good friends with the governor and with also good friends with our not-so-pal McCullough, and Bob McCullough. And he used to be a police officer. He is now the managing director of the Police Officers Association of St. Louis. He is also a well-known member of the Klan, the Ku Klux Klan. And so he has very little desire to actually negotiate or think about shifting his relationship with people in neighborhoods. He is very invested in actually policing black neighborhoods a lot. And the governor continues to support him. Meanwhile, there's a separate Black Police Officers Association that is disagreeing, but most of the news media isn't actually listening to them. Instead, they're listening to the St. Louis Police Officers Association, which is the white one. And so the layers of racism that are present, especially in particular among the police force and in those who have political power, make it difficult to really think about shifting the justice framework. But people are doing that when they're saying, locally we're going to do our own policing. Locally we're going to do our own taking care of our neighborhood and our safety, because the police force cannot be dependent on that. For that, they can actually be dependent on not to make us safe, to make us less safe. So that's the justice piece, yeah. And I want to start to wrap up, because there was that one question about what could you do, who could you give to, and there are a lot of directions you can go in New York and in Ferguson in terms of providing support, because that's actually a lot of what folks need, is some level of support. And I can say trying to find a way in that feels really genuine after these stories, because it's this is me being honest. So where I right now would love if folks were able to support is to give to 3 different places, and the way that I'm doing it is trying to be really clean about it, because folks on the ground, like a lot of the folks on this wall, some of them are in organizations and some of them are not. And so there's a lot of politics about, like, who are you giving money to, and I'm glad to spread out money among folks, which is what I've done some so far, because I have the relationships to do that. And so, and at the same time, I got sent and was able to go there explicitly. So what I would suggest doing is really, at this point, what I worked out is you can make a donation to Quaker Action Team, which allowed me to help feed people, drive people around, do a lot of work, and volunteers picked up my slack. Like I'm one of 2 part-time staff members, and volunteers during one of our busiest times stepped up to say, we're going to do this work for nothing, and we're going to make sure our money is going to Ferguson. And right now, I would love if y'all who are here in support could support the work of Quaker Action Team, Training for Change, and folks in Ferguson. And so if you give to Quaker Action Team and write Ferguson in the note field of PayPal, you go to like eqat.org/Ferguson. And when this becomes a YouTube video, I'll like point here, and you'll see a link that'll show up on your screen. And if you give there, then I will make sure that money goes straight to folks who are doing work. Either through Training for Change, it'll go to the fellowship that allowed Kim, who was my partner down there. She did so much work, especially when I was able to build only so much of a relationship with some of the women down there who were being ignored. Like, we saw that the women just weren't getting the level of support that the men were. The Fellowship for People of Color that she's a part of allowed her to show up, and she was able to train them to figure out how are they advocating for themselves, how are they making their voices heard, how are they being a part of the strategy conversation and the media narrative. I mean, she did media trainings a lot with folks, just one-on-one. And so Earthquaker Action Team said, we'll let our staff member go, and we'll pay his salary so I don't lose my house and my home and my place to live. And folks in Ferguson keep doing work and keep organizing. So it's eqat.org/donate, and that money will go right to folks doing the work every day. And so those are some of the stories. I have a lot more stories. If you are curious about hearing more stories, I, just to be very honest, have only so much energy about saying them one-on-one. But I have a lot of more energy for saying them to groups of people. So if you have a group that you're like, hey, these stories could be really helpful, like just recently I was out at a college and they wanted to hear more about it, and so I was talking with them, and we sort of merged the stories into a workshop where they were talking about what's the racism stuff that's happening on campus every day that folks aren't talking about. And now they're actually building some campaigns to shift some things about faculty being retained on campus, students of color being retained on campus, and that the sort of admissions myth that's out there actually become the reality for what's happening on campus. And so if there's a group that you're a part of, I'm glad to think through that with you. Feel free to get in touch. If you got this announcement some way, feel free to circle back through that friend to get in touch as well. And I really would when I did storytelling in person, I would share songs. Eileen, you have a question? Or
well, I'm getting a question through the email for you to say something about the people on the wall behind you. Will Matthew tell us more about the people on the wall behind him?
I can tell you very, very quickly. Very, very quickly. I'm going to do my best. Could you help, Mo?
Yeah,
And just yank down photos one by one. I'll give you quick snippets, because every other time I've started with them. This is Charmel, and this is Ebony. Both of them are involved in the Show Me 15 campaign. If you've been wondering what unions are doing to support folks, SEIU and the Show Me 15 folks have showed up in force. They gave their staff time to work on stuff that's happening in Ferguson. Charmel is loud and passionate and totally will not let herself get put down. She is such a great advocate. This is Daruba. We spent a lot of time together, and he has been organizing a ton of actions. Like the die-in that happened before the indictment, that's so Daruba. I mean, he was the one with the megaphone. Lots of times you'll see him with a megaphone. Black Soldiers, he started Black Soldiers. Tribex, he started Tribex, some of the groups that are showing up in the news. This is Tef.
Matthew?
Yep.
Can you just hold them kind of still for a second, because it's sort of like
Here we go. I can do it.
There we go. Just for a second. Thanks.
This is Tef. Tef is on news media all the time. Democracy Now!, CNN. He just got back from New York City, doing all sorts of media stuff. He's been a community organizer for a while. He's been doing voter turnout. He actually stopped some of his career to do organizing in St. Louis when asked. Diamond, a writer who wrote the article, I'm from Ferguson and I'm fed up, that went around the news in August. Diamond is a good friend who I need to text soon. Tori, who got famous by a fluke. The news media made him famous, but he really thinks smart about how to support folks. And he was such a key person and passionate, and he does so much for his son Lucas. There is Howard. I think he's an amazing translator and skilled person, and we continue to do regular coaching as he figures out organizing in St. Louis. And he's a natural-born facilitator. He wades his way through conflict easily. I have so many more stories. Janina, also with the Show Me 15 campaign, real quiet, and yet one of the best people I know, who knows how to keep track of her people in the midst of chaos. There's Autumn. Autumn is harder to see there. She's there holding one of Daruba's dogs. And Autumn keeps track of things in a way that a lot of people don't. So she'll listen through conversations and just keep track over time. She has just really shown up on her own and is really finding a new voice in this. It's really great to see. She was the youngest person I worked with regularly. This is Alexis, who's a great singer and part of Black Soldiers and out there regularly. And I really liked to work with Alexis. She's not connected personally. And here is Kim and me and Tori in Kim's first selfie that I think she posted on Instagram. This is us at 2 a.m. Anyway, Kim was that fellowship person. She was doing work all the time with me on the ground. She actually extended her stay to stay fully with me. So those are some of the folks who I spent time with. There are more people, whether that's Taylor or Jeff or Alexis or Ariel or Julia or Montego or Aaron or Colleen. I'm just naming some of the people who I don't want to go without naming. Jamala Rogers, my dance partner, while I was there, who just recently wrote an article that I posted on Facebook. Jamala Rogers, civil rights activist, writer, great person to know. There are brilliant people in St. Louis who are doing great work and continue to do great work. And your support of them really helps make it possible. And you showing up in actions helps make it possible for them. It gives them hope that they're not alone in doing this work. So thank you very much for being a part of this in whatever way you're able to. I'm going to log off. Have a great night, everyone.